Gabriel did his PhD under Wilson Mendonça's supervision. He was also, he went to the US as a visiting student under John Searle's supervision. And then he, later on, he's now a collaborator at Georg Northoff lab at the University of Ottawa, where he's spent some time as in his sabbatical. And, well, an old friend of all of us here, and it's always great to see you back.
Thanks a lot. I'll start my talk with some aesthetic influence I had. I don't know if this is based on Schopenhauer or Wittgenstein, but it seems that aesthetic and ethics were kind of together. So that's my inspiration. That's not a fake, that's a hack license used in preparation for Taxi Driver. Actually is in the alma mater of Brian and Marco in the University of Texas of Austin in the museum, the Harry Ransom Center. So that's a serious inspiration to me, because Robert De Niro spent a month as a night cab driver to really have an immersion on the reality of a cab driver, to be able to represent a cab driver in a decent way. So that's exactly where I think was my aim with neuroscience. But at the end, I like it so much to drive this cab, I'll keep driving, but I'll keep driving the cab during the day because it's easier to recruit people, and I do philosophy by the night. Then I can do it alone, okay. Okay, so general aims of this talk: establishing an emergentist metaphysical background, showing if what Chalmers says about weak emergence is right, my model is a good case for weak emergentism and a defense of physicalism. Showing that a traditional idea of free will, in its full-fledged sense, is not a viable one. Showing that we have to accommodate a humble notion of decision-making within a deterministic view. Exploring objective, subjective, and intersubject aspects of decision-making, especially focus on the contrasts between merely hedonic and economic decision-making, and I'll show as well some cases of self-control. As we go along, we'll be showing how to design an experiment to test a philosophical hypothesis. Well, so in strong and weak emergence, Chalmers says, we can say that a higher level phenomenon is strongly emergent with respect to a low-level domain when the high-level phenomenon arises from the low-level domain. But truths concerning that phenomenon are not deducible, even in principle, from truths in the low-level domain. Strong emergence is the notion of emergence that is most common in philosophical discussions of emergence. And it's the notion invoked by the British emergentists in the 1920s. And then he defines weak emergence. We can say there are higher level phenomena weakly emergent with respect to a low level domain when the high level phenomenon arises from the low level domain. But truths concerning that phenomenon are unexpected given the principles governing the low level domain. Weak emergence is the notion of emergence that is used most common in recent scientific studies. And then Chalmers makes an important consideration on the relevance of strong and weak emergence, dividing the relevance of each of those cases. He says, in a way, the philosophical morals of strong emergence and weak emergence are diametrically opposed. Strong emergence, if it exists, can be used to reject the physicalist picture of the world as fundamentally incomplete. By contrast, weak emergence can be used to support the physicalist picture of the world by showing how all sorts of phenomena that might seem novel and irreducible at a first sight can nevertheless be grounded in underlying simple laws. That's my main target here of my model of emergence. We might instead understand weak emergence in terms of the ease of understanding one level in terms of another. Emergent properties are usually properties that are more easily understood in their own right than in terms of properties at a lower level. This suggests an important observation. Weak emergence appears to be an observer relative property. Some people think that that's very dangerous. I think if Chalmers is right, even better to my model, because I say I'm defending a form of epistemological emergence in some sense. But Chalmers further says that to capture this, one might suggest that weak emergence is the phenomenon wherein complex, interesting, high-level function is produced as a result of combining simple low-level mechanisms and simple ways. I think this is much closer to good definitions of emergence. Forgot about the COBOL programs. Let's go to the end. Some have tried to explicate them in terms of Shaitin-Kolmogorov-Solomonov complexity. I don't use exactly Shaitin-Kolmogorov-Solomonov complexity, but I'll use a kind of similar strategy, using also the same roots that give rise to this branch of ways of studying complexity, namely Shannon's entropy and Ryan's emergence. So I think if Chalmers is right, my model is still a good candidate of a strong, weak emergent model. Okay, so Shannon information entropy. I take in it as correct. Basically, I take in it as correct. I want you just to illustrate a case here. Let us say I am a pundit in a radio, and I say, now we're gonna play a song for an English band, and you guys already withdraw all the possibilities of bands that are not from England. And now I say, it's a band from Liverpool, and you have a lot of guesses which band it's gonna be. And I say, it's the Beatles, okay? So now we have all the Beatles albums to guess as possibilities. And I say, it's Sgt. Pepper, Lonely Heart Club Band. And then I say the name of a song. Whenever I say the name of a song, you have zero doubt what I'm talking about. So I say, I'm gonna play Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. So when I'm doing that, see that the level of doubt is decreasing. The level of uncertainty is decreasing. That's not just important for my model of emergence, but that's also important to my model of decision-making. I think decision-making is exactly the same thing. We're restraining possibilities in favor of a given one. Please keep that in mind. Use your working memory to keep that in mind. That's important for the whole talk. Okay, so sometimes when someone comes to you and to ask, are you researching, and say, I work with emergence, the first objection that you always have is emergence circular? Or sometimes an even stronger claim, is emergence a form of begging the question? Because if you define a level as something that reveals a new property, a novel property, and then you define a novel property as something that is an upper level, you're at least circular. So, which is my strategy to avoid this basic error, is to define emergence in terms of resolution and scope. Resolution is about information, is an epistemological property. Scope is a physical property. Okay? So, M stands for macro state. The English my, or the Greek my, or me, in the Greek, stands for microstate. So what I'm saying there is the resolution of a macrostate is smaller or equals to the resolution of a microstate, and the scope of a macrostate equals or is bigger than the scope of a microstate. Okay? Good. So inspired in different scholars, I will show all the distinctive features of my account. Ascendant inclusivity. Ascendant inclusivity is an ontological question. Everything that is chemical is still physical. Descendant exclusivity. I say that descendant exclusivity is an epistemological property. there are some relationships within chemistry that will not be explained by the vocabulary of physics. Now I'm invoking the notion of proprietary vocabulary as Andrew Melnick, for example, does. Another important feature is that emergent properties are subtractive conditions rather than something that is being added to the system. That's a very important strategy to define like that, because following the example I give here of the Beatles, I'm saying being Sgt. Pepper's is not being Abbey Road, is not being the rest of the albums, okay? So that's a problem since Aristotle, because in Greek it's paraholos. The bad translation was something beyond the parts. The whole is something beyond the parts. I'm just saying, actually, the best word to translate Aristotle's baby is tangent to the parts. And I think a systemic property is being defined as something that is revealed, that is actualized, by the negation of the other properties. So nothing is being added to the system, so I don't have the problem of breaking the causal closure of the world in philosophy of mind, or the principle of conservation of energy in physics. That's a great advantage of this model. And also, I'll say that determination is substituting causality in superior levels. Determination is about how a system is organized. And the way a system is organized makes a difference. Otherwise, I invite people to have snooker and pool games. Are gonna use a ball, you're gonna use a dice. Let's see who will have better results. Or whatever, it's anything, form makes a difference in this board. Okay, the ontological thesis that I need in order to do that, very humble. Novelty. It's hard to deny novelty. I mean, even a Laplacian intellect or whatever, we could easily, it's a cheap, not very expensive thesis to recognize the things that were not seen before as seen as the universe follows the course of time. I think mutations, just a simple, good example. Organization properties, the fact that this glass is concave instead of convex is a good example that makes a difference. Systemic properties are important. The most contagion thesis here is physical monism, but let us accept it for the sake of the argument, and accept it as well, I would say, even as a putative premise, try to reduce me, whatever. So now, in this article, it's an article published in Portuguese, but even though the translation of the name is Physical Monism and the Dynamic Option, or for physicalism of forces or interactions as a better option to deal with Hampel's dilemma. Basically, I have a lot of considerations on how to reboot Hampel's dilemma, and I'll enter into them. I just got to the meaty part of it. Basically, what I'm saying is that someone that's really a naturalist, you have to be concerned with processes. So it's better to think of your definition of physical in terms of forces. What is physical? My definition is what is given by the fundamental forces of physics. In our current knowledge is strong and weak forces, electromagnetism, and gravity. I don't enter into the philosophical details, but I want to say that I have a positive definition of physics that can even be fleshed out in terms of our current physics. And I think, for example, Melnick and Kim, they use very imprecise terms as bits of matter or whatever is written in the official textbooks of the best physics departments and things like that. I think it's not a very courageous definition or a very courageous strategy to define physical in this way. I think you have to give some positive content to it. Well, okay. So that's my motto, and let's go for decision making. I'll read the whole thing, sorry about that. Decision-making processes are mostly understood here as an integration of different levels of information processing in the brain or any other mechanism you could have to promote decisions that could encompass interoceptive and ceroceptive influences, envisaging selection of a possible course of action. Considering that integration of this information could present conflicts, our most important decisional capacities are defined as assignment of values, conflict monitoring, mediation, and solution of conflict. Beyond the capacity of assigning, calculating native values, the main mechanisms of decision-making are inhibition, filtering, or suppression of concurrent stimuli and goal values as inhibitory capacities and maximization of stimuli and more solid goal values as stimulatory amplification power. This is kind of William James rephrased in contemporary Rupage. Finally, more preparation and action are fundamental and could also be modulated strategically by the capacities above. The traditional idea of free will in its metaphysically full-bound sense is on par with other scientifically superannuated ideas, vitalism, phlogiston, and geocentrism. Here, Case Beer and Churchill are influencing me, of course. Neurophilosophy aims at creating an interface between neuroscience and philosophy, and a dualist account is not able to contribute to this target. I thought I skipped 2 slides that are supposed to be there, but what I'm saying is also, this is not an incompatibilist account. It's not also a compatibilist account. Why? I think incompatibilism you have, as you say, if you have 2 horns of a dilemma, we cannot compatibilize them. But compatibilism as well assumes some form of, let us say, putative dualism. Because there's nothing compatible. Everything's physical. Question is how we integrate different levels of information processing. Okay, then something that was explored by the definition Barry used it yesterday, the idea we could be doing something different. I'd rather be playing soccer than be here. I'd rather be at Coachella, some rock show, or I'd rather be surfing, or wherever you can project there as well. Look, that's one of the most contentious questions. Could you be doing something else that we're doing now? It just seems that you're not perfectly deterministic. That's a serious question. I think I'll give some hints on how to solve this puzzle at the end, okay? So first thing, this is an article I published in Neuroscience and Neuroeconomics, actually with my brother, To Buy or Not to Buy, a review of affective priming purchase decision. You see that whenever you use priming, affective priming, to suggest people to buy stuff, you bypass consciousness, and people do things, they even report they didn't want to do it. And people, when they have conscious control, they not go for those options. So it seems that if you got all the literature on affective priming purchase decision, what you're going to see is that consciousness makes a difference as a selective mechanism. And if you bypass consciousness, you lose those mechanisms. It's at least a negative good evidence in favor of the importance of consciousness. We review all the articles available in this area. They are not much, but we review all the articles trying to find connections between them. Okay, this is a neural basis of decision-making and assessment issues on testability and philosophical relevance. This is an article I published in a meeting that we have in India, in Mumbai. And the article tries to differentiate assessment from actual decision-making, and also the article treats the philosophical relevance of the difference between assessment and decision-making when you actually have an external act and when you're just assessing, evaluating things, and it makes a lot of difference as well. We use some studies on social decision-making, some studies about, for example, racism. And you see when you bypass consciousness and the pictures are presented in a subliminal level, people can't control their racism, but when you show these pictures in a supraliminal level, people try to control their disgusting behavior. So there are good evidence that control is also important for decision making, and the consciousness again makes a difference for decision making. But what I'm saying is that everything is explained by amplification or inhibition. Amplification and inhibition are just normal mechanisms every electrical engineer work with. Is explained by the entropy information for Claude Shannon. It's not really a problem for physicalists. And the other one is the meditation and the brain. Actually, this article was awarded with the Josh Bedekar College Prize for Young Researchers, given by the Humanities section of the World Psychiatry Association and the Indian Council for Philosophical Research. I dared to explain what is meditation in physical terms to the Indians. And I show that attention, control, and emotion are strictly related when you do meditation. I try to analyze two types of meditations. 1-point concentration meditation, the simplest type of meditation, and compassion meditation. So in 1-point concentration meditation, you try to suppress every emotion or every form of representative content in favor of almost a kind of resting state in the brain. In the other form of meditation, you try to maximize good emotions towards peers, toward other people. And so that's a very good way to show that we have self-control somehow. We can modulate our own brain waves. That's a field that being explored. Actually, I did a tutorial in one of the ASSCs with the people using biofeedback to make children control their own brains instead of taking Ritalin, for example. And they are pretty successful. This is a Malcolm Brown picture of Tin Quan Duc, a highly trained monk in the Vietnam War. This denies a lot of things that are stated as simple truths, objective truths, in handbooks in medicine. Because this guy is controlling both his sympathetic reflex system and autonomic system. And that is done in favor of a moral cause. So we have to rearrange part of the physiology, the official physiology, to incorporate like very competent levels of self-control. For the younger people, the people that like hardcore, this is the picture in the cover of the first album of Rage Against the Machine.
Did he survive?
What?
Did he survive?
No. No, he's self-immolating. He's self-immolating. So that's exactly why the picture is important. Okay. This is I received the prize for the other article. I was invited for being a special editor of Frontiers in Neuroscience. Actually, the highest impact factor in neuroscience. First time, it's a benchmark, not because me and Carlos were the editors, but because it's the first time that Brazilians are invited to Frontiers in Neuroscience, and the first time philosophers are invited to criticize neuroscientists in the main vehicle they have to publish. So this that was edited by me and Carlos Eduardo, that some of you know from philosophy of mind. This is the very interesting article, distinction between externally versus internally guided decision-making, operational difference, meta-analytical comparisons, and their theoretical implications. That's why I ended up in Canada. Takashi Nakao, Hideki Ohira, and Georg Notov came up with a very interesting meta-analytical article. Basically, the article meta-analysis is something that you do in neuroscience. There's a very, very Aristotelian method. Get all the evidence available and try to get the essence of it. See what? It's necessary because it's something that is present in all the cases. The space war is not present in all the cases, and you try to make comparisons using some categories. So the categories that they use are internally guided and externally guided decision making, meaning externally guided decision making are experiments where you need to have an objective response, but they are uncertain, so you have to try to minimize your uncertainty to get the correct response. Internally guided decision making, there's no objective or intersubjective correct response, but depends on the needs and values of an organism. And they could differentiate two different networks. Beautiful, clean result, but not. As an editor, I read the 300 abstracts and conclusions for all the experiments they squashed in the meta-analysis. And I find something very different. If I were you, I'll categorize in a 3 categories way and not a binary category, and just two categories. So I said to them that there was like immense work to them to make it again. I said, why you don't divide, instead of internally guided decision making, externally guided, assuming that internally guided is subjective and externally guided is objective, a third category, let's refine that, let's be more fine grade and try to find the experiments that have subjective influence but are more social, depends on the external world in terms of intersubjectivity, meaning studies on moral decision or economic decision that depends on other people, or they try to study what Hume will call empathy. Let's create a third category on that and see what's happened. And what's happened, they found, because of my suggestions as an editor, a specific neural network that works with externally guided decision making, a kind of intersubjective level. So especially the IFG and the dorsal medial prefrontal cortex and the insular frontal gyrus, or gyrus in Latin, they especially light up for moral empathetic decision making. So after that, Georg said, if you have both knowledges in neuroscience and philosophy to do something like that, I prefer to have you as a collaborator than an editor. And then I was invited to go to Canada. So you've seen some overlaps between externally and externally decision making. And you see some overlaps also between the social, but we have this specific network for the social decision making, especially moral and empathetic decision making. We could even refine these categories in terms of moral decision making and more intersubjective, empathetic, but that was enough to show how a close reading, a philosophical close reading, can improve neuroscience as well. So I think it's a path with two hands. Things goes in both ways. Philosophy can improve neuroscience showing how to refine categorical assumptions and avoiding performative begging the question, because you want to prove something that is already in your experimental design. And also, I think we philosophers could get the best results we have so far to inform our theories as well. So I think that things work better in this way. So this is the book. It's called Decision-Making Experience Under Philosophical Analysis, Human Choice as a Challenge for Neuroscience. It was edited by me and Carlos Eduardo. I want to cite one of the book that was transformed into a book as well, because like the most read special editions are turned into a book, so it was turned into a book. There's a lot of good people that contributed, Shadlin and Adina Roski, Gert Gigehenza, Chris Frith, some living legends. I want to cite especially Adina Roski's article, The Neurobiology of Decision-Making and Responsibility, Reconciling Mechanisms of Mindedness. Actually, I'll quote my analysis of it. In this article, we need to make the ombudsman of the edition. It's already a Metacritic thing, but I do the Metacritic. So I say Shadlin and Roski's argue for the possibility of reconciling responsibility of neurobiology and mechanisms by philosophically reviewing presuppositions and implications of recent empirical studies in neurobiology. Instead of the more traditional account of compatibilism based on an appeal to randomness or noise as a source of freedom, they rather recognize that randomness could possibly establish the background against which policies have to be adopted. Although the argument does not favor compatibilists of freedom with determinists per se, it contends that compatibilism with responsibility and mechanisms is possible. The argument functions in a hypothetical manner. If agents can be accountable for policies that in some sense determine decisions, they can be held responsible for those decisions, even if they do not have conscious access to the reasons for those decisions. So I disagree with Adina and Shadlin because I'm not a compatibilist, and I don't think introducing randomness is the best strategy. I think exactly as I defined it before, decisions about diminishing randomness. But I very much like the strategy of disentangling policies for actions that are about to occur. That kind of reminds the intention to act and intention in action from Searle, but in a more refined way. What Adina is saying is that, for example, a guy has problems with alcohol. It's better if he avoids the way that pass in front of a bar, go for the other block to home to avoid passing in front of a bar. So what is important? It seems very simple what I'm saying, or what Adina is saying, but that's very important because if you understand information entropy in the way I'm understanding, when you have multiple possibilities, you have more randomness, more uncertainty, you can arrange things to achieve a way. Whenever the pressure is just there, things happen. Okay? So I think even if I disagree with somebody, with both compatibilism and the importance of randomness, this is a very, very interesting suggestion. How am I doing with time? Actually, I'll make a joke in the beginning saying that what I know a priori is that I will not be able to do with time, but it seems I'll be denied.
You have 10 minutes officially.
Yeah, that's exactly, yeah. But everyone uses 10 minutes more, it's okay. Resting state EEG power predicts conflict-related brain activity in internally guided but not externally guided decision making. Again, as you can feel, the divide between internally and externally guided decision making, there is the philosophical motivation of Northoff is very Kantian. He's really influenced by Kant, so he tries to understand that the internal as the realm of freedom and external, the realm of mechanicism. I disagree with that, and we already seen how this disagreement generated new scientific results. So I show another way to disagree with that and promote more refined results as well. Let's go. So what is interesting here is that we can do a subjective neuroscience. When I'm talking about subjective neuroscience, that must be clarified. We can study subjects individually, and what we could do here is to correlate a neurosignature that is recorded from the brain at resting state and predict courses of action based on this neurosignature in the brain in the resting state. So we have a neurosignature, then when you don't have any external stimuli, your brain have a pattern. And we can predict subjective decisions, but not external decisions. We cannot predict objective decisions because they depend on the external world, but for this neural pattern, there's a subjective signature. We can, for example, predict which occupation or color, things that are highly subjective, you would prefer to choose. So that's an interesting point. But I want to make clear, I said that to Sophia in the coffee break, Sophia defended a view as a neuroscience of consciousness as a normal science. I think it's more complicated than that. I think it's a bizarre science, a kind of odd science at least. We try to normalize as much as possible, but still, we have to recognize the subjectivity as a self-referring mechanism is a reiterative, mathematically speaking, mechanism. So a normal science is not exactly able to bridge the gap. So it is a difficult task with a lot of pitfalls that are possible to, and I'll concede to Chalmers that it's not, as I said, it's never exhaustive. There's something you're always missing. But we try some creative strategies to approach it. One of them is to compare verbal reports of actual decisions and the original patterns that the brain has in resting state. So we can even create statistically bias of decisions based on the previous experience and subjective orientations the participants have to discount from the actual decisions. Those are creative ways to try to understand how subjective it functions. Exhaustive. But what is exhaustive in science? Come on. And also, you see, we use Pearson correlations and conflict between the N2 potentials. There is actually the moment of doubt in the decision. It's very fine mathematics to find a way to correspond the moment of doubt, the areas of brain, even if it's EEG, the FCZ's area, the frontal cortex in Z, is very important to this type of decisions. It's being hypothesized by Georg years and years ago, and the more that we test, the more that you prove it, there's subjectivity. It cannot be reduced to the midline cortex regions, but the midline cortex regions are very well related to subjectivity, but it's not about localizationism, it's more about complex patterns that represent the states. Then comes my experiment. First of all, I did a huge socioeconomic and anthropological research to see how young Canadians give gifts to each other in their birthdays. And then we tried to compare, we introduced the third level, the intersubjective level. Instead of just working with internal and external decision-making, we try, actually the divide between objective, subjective is kind of defined in Searlean terms, whereas objectives defined here has our objective response, and subjective something that depends on the subject. And also we introduced a third category based on empathy, strict human empathy. We test that. So the objective question, of course, it's not exactly objective because economics depends on people, but the response is objective. Which product is more expensive? Second question, which of those gifts for yourself? Subjective answer. Which of those gifts for your friend? So we ask people to imagine a unique friend, to keep this friend in memory, to take all these decisions, and which of those goods they will give to those friends as a gift. And those are my stimuli. But I was very glad that my intuitions are confirmed by my socioeconomic research, but at the end, I end up working with things I like: books, bottles of wines, and chocolate boxes. But that was the actual socioeconomic research gave me as things that are given by young Canadians as birthday gifts, more common type of gifts. So we have these three categories of stimuli: chocolate boxes, books, and bottles of wine. This is very ecologically relevant. There's not much difference from Amazon compare products. So the type of decision you can have in a normal context when you're buying by the internet. And also, I used a strategy that was used before in neuroscience, that is to say to the participants, one of the trials is gonna be randomly picked to count as for real. And that's gonna be discounted for your prolabore. So people take all decisions seriously, instead of those experiments that people just pressing the button to go to finish as fast as possible. That was a very important measure to make people engage in the experiment. It was as it were a real day-by-day decision, because the money that they get to participate in this study was discounted, and they had one of those gifts. They get one of real gifts out of the lab in their hands. Of course, as we work in a hospital, wines are out of the computer selection, just could give books or chocolate boxes. That was not informed to the participants. But okay. So those are the stimuli. And then I have a second block. Those are the real stimuli. I introduced price as an external constraint. And then, what the problem we have now? The subjective decisions that we could predict with price, the conflict is so big between hedonic level and hedonic economic level, we could not predict anymore. We can predict subjective things, but we cannot predict some subjective, objective tension. Those are part of the stimuli. I will not, I mean, if you want to, everyone is interested in the type of mathematical analysis we did, or I'm ready to talk about. A little bit more on areas of the brain and to amplitude, but as we are specific, very, very sophisticated bands, frequency bands analysis, but I don't think in a philosophical atmosphere I need to do that, but if anyone is interested, we could talk about. Let's go for some conclusions and prospections to the future. There's an E instead of an N there. That's a problem translating slides, and sometimes you forget to translate the whole thing. If you understand agents as part of a unique physical world, there is no necessity to defend a strong or metaphysical version of compatibilism. What we have to compatibilize is indeed various levels of information processing, more or less automatized. Only a purely physicalist but complex multi-level model is able to accommodate this scenario. Free will in its full-fledged sense does not exist, although electric mechanisms of amplification and suppression are responsible for attention and self-control, and attention and self-control are responsible for decision-making. Issues related to self-control, we forward, semantic and decisional indeterminacy must be explored in further detail in joint actions between philosophers and neuroscientists. That's an intuition I want to work with, but I didn't have the opportunity yet. The anterior cingulate is an area of the brain that lights up when you have doubts, but when you have conflict monitoring, and it lights up for both problems of decision-making, but also problems of semantic doubts. When a word has two possible meanings, it lights up as well. So semantic indeterminacy must be a very important thing to understand problems of decision-making as well. How things are phrased in a kind, referential way, or how they are doubtful. It's not just a coincidence that the same brain area lights up in the two cases. It's all about deciding which is the best option. This sense of the word, this sense of the word, or this course of action, this course of action. I'm just saying that something I think people could explore. I don't know if I'll be able. I have another project now to be explored in Canada, more about still economic decision-making in times of subjectivity, hyperbolic discount, and exponential discount, trying to bridge the gap between Donald Davidson and George Anderson in pico-economics, that mean microeconomics. But this is something that must be explored if anyone is able to explore the relationship between semantic indeterminacy and decisional indeterminacy is highly encouraged. Ecologically relevant paradigms able to test decision-making and option decisions in different levels, interlevels, are necessary to shed light shed further light in this picture. When you say option decisions, I'm saying that because of the I'd rather be. The idea that was defended as a premise as also by Barry, the way that David Lewis phrased it, the idea, or even Dennett, when he trying to have a milder version of accommodate free and a compatibilist picture, they said the strong idea is to show that it could be otherwise. So option decisions are stronger than like go, no-go decisions, or just kind of simple repressions. So that's why I work with various options to provoke this kind of way, if it's possible, to test, I would say, alternative course of actions. Degrees of dependence and independence of external factors, more objective, and social and subjective levels must be addressed. That's what we're trying to do so far. Thank you all very much.
Only 3 minutes over. That's good. Questions, anyone?
What do you think is the causal role of consciousness in decision making?
What's the causal role? Selection. Selection. Okay. So let's go back to the examples I cite. Consciousness and decision making, especially examples of repression. For example, in this, when you use affective priming, for example, and you see when you bypass consciousness, people have very different decisions. So I think all the good models we have of consciousness so far, and if you appeal to hi-fi or being in the global workspace, they make a difference. Exactly what is lacking here in the affective priming strategy to bypass consciousness. They have lo-fi. They are not integrated in the global workspace. When they are integrated, people can repress those stimuli. So that's a very William James-like type of way of understanding consciousness. But I really think that attention as a form of maximizing stimuli and inhibitory mechanism of form of minimizing stimuli are really important to the way we represent things. And the way we represent things makes a difference in the way we decide. Valences, biological valences, for example, the example I gave to Francisco yesterday, saliency is something kind of objective. It's the contrast, the way that a special figure jumps from the background in its gestalt. But valence is organism-based. Of course, we have a common species history, so we have a lot in common as well, but there are various subjective differences between people. So, why am I talking about that? Let me come back to the idea that let's forget the subjective thing for a while, but let's say that consciousness in this way depends on valences. Valences are part of our species, but they also have subjective signatures. For example, being sweet is a positive value for most of the organisms. But for example, when the narrator of Proust is talking about the Madeleines, he has a special relation with it. It's beyond the biological valence, you have also a value, and value is related to a semantic representation. So whenever you have semantic representation, maximizing things, you enter in a very representational and subjective sphere, and I think being integration of information in consciousness can have even those higher order features as well. And they make a difference. But even just for integrating this information with hi-fi or in the global workspace makes a difference because physiologically speaking, the signal is available for the rest of the brain and you make it feasible to be suppressed or amplified for different brain areas. So that's exactly where the frontal lobes work, you know, in inputting amplificatory signals or inhibiting. So that's why I think consciousness makes a difference. Because when you're conscious, you have access to the information beyond having just the phenomenal content of it. You can manipulate it, and the brain is pretty able to manipulate information and to maximize or amplify it. That's the main story. I don't know if you're satisfied, but if you can make me a more precise question about what I'm stating so far, I can be more precise as well to say specific roles of consciousness. I showed some examples. For example, repression. If the information is subliminal, consciousness cannot repress this information. If it enters the global workspace of it has high five, it can be suppressed. So that's why consciousness makes a difference, because consciousness is a selective mechanism for everything. Consciousness is a filter. So whenever things bypass this filter, whenever things enter into this global workspace or they have high five, they are available for assessment.
So you've given a potential causal role for access consciousness.
Exactly.
Do you have a causal role for phenomenal consciousness?
That's a good question. Look, for pure phenomenal consciousness, not. But in the way access consciousness can manipulate phenomenal consciousness, yes. But not in phenomenal consciousness per se. Because, for example, let us say that I'm selecting tomatoes in a fair market, and I use my distinctions of color and smell to, to pick up the good ripe tomatoes, but not the rotten ones. So the phenomenal consciousness is just causally relevant whenever it is accessible, but per se, not. That's my best answer so far for the top of mind. No, access consciousness. Access consciousness.
Maybe I'm going to ask. I mean, that's not the one you are modeling. Can you kind of guess a way of modeling phenomenal consciousness?
For sure, but
getting a set to this experimental.
There are a lot of competent people doing that. I'm not especially interested in perception. I'm really concerned with things that are at the end. I don't know. At some given moment, I was a student in the AASSC of Caltech, and I had both important figures asked me this question. It was a twist in my career. It was Dennett and Andrew Brook. Both of them said, you have a beautiful model of emergence, you apply that to decision making, what about imputability? The real problem with decision making is could arrest or not people. So if you don't talk about the neuroethics implications of all you're saying are not interested. So show which are the implications, the moral implications of your model. And then I twisted all my research to try to understand responsibility and imputability, how much we can control or not, suppress, inhibit, or maximize, how consciousness works as a selective thing. That's why I can give a causal relevance for access consciousness, but I never guess about phenomenal consciousness. But I think you just can manipulate information if working memory is able to give them to appear in the global workspace. I've been trained by Bernard Bars, as also by their hypothesis. I think when information enters the global space, it's manipulable. And that's why I just focus on access consciousness. It's 10 years. And I think I can show that we have a causal relevance for access consciousness. And so far, from the top of my mind, because of David's question, I would guess that phenomenal consciousness just have a causal relevance whenever it turns into access consciousness. I'm not saying the phenomenal content is not important, but phenomenal content must be available for access consciousness to be causal relevant in decision making. That's what I'm saying. But I'm not denying it. I'm just saying
So about
absolutely unexpected question, but great one.
About phenomenal consciousness in itself, are you a phenomenist?
No, I'm saying, look, phenomenal consciousness is a stage of consciousness. It's not a different thing. I mean, if I were a medieval guy, I wouldn't say that phenomenal consciousness is a quiddity. Phenomenal consciousness is a level of consciousness that when has hi-fi or enter the global space turns into access consciousness. I don't know if they are different metaphysical types. I think phenomenal consciousness is what we have is exteroceptive information being integrated to a mid-level of the brain. But when it goes to the higher level of processing, it's already access consciousness. It's still phenomenal content that was acquired by phenomenal consciousness, but it jumps to another level of sophistication where it is accessible. That's what I'm saying. No, that block, I don't think you problematize this interpretation of his work.
Thank you, Gabriel. So we don't, I mean, in some cases, for example, when you go to the market and you decide what sort of tomatoes you want to buy on the basis of phenomenal consciousness, I can understand how access consciousness assesses the information already available at the level of phenomenal representation.
Okay, exactly.
What is going on, for example, in those cases of unilateral neglect, for example, when decisions are so far taken, for example, those classical experiments in which you have a house and there's fire on the...
Burning house, Michael Tye.
Exactly.
Example.
So and then you compare the data you get from people with unilateral neglect with people with normal capabilities. In that cases, you would simply say that they have access consciousness but not phenomenal consciousness.
You're trying to invert Michael Tye's strategy, but
Yeah.
Michael Tye in the Burning House is trying to show that representation is necessary for consciousness to have a causal relevance. Exactly the unilateral neglect of the Burning House is a way that Michael Tye uses to show that it's not about perception, it's about how you deal with assessment of perception. But you're trying to invert the strategy. You're saying, look, is this access consciousness? I mean, I don't know if I agree with you or Michael Tye, but I tend to agree with Michael Tye that this shows that this information is not being useful in the lower level, but is used in a higher level. But I think it's very thought-provoking the way that you inverted the example. I would have to think a little bit more to understand if this is possible. But your strategy is exactly trying to reinterpret the results in favor of a more basic interpretation. This is not really canonical what you're saying. It's possible, but I will stick with Michael Tye interpretation, even if I'm not a representationalist.
Good evening. I would like to know, do you think that the concept of free will is necessary?
No.
I mean, no?
No.
That's what I expected. I mean, there are other ways you can justify responsibility and such and such.
Yeah. Look, it's a shame that I skipped it to two slides. I have a very well developed writing about that, but I can explain it anyways. What I'm saying is, if you accept that we are physical, you're not breaking any physical law when you interfere in the world, because we are physical as well. So we're part of the causal chain. And what I'm saying on the top of that is that we have amplificatory and inhibitory capacities, and this is pure electromagnetism. You don't have a problem with that. So we are amplifiers or inhibitors of information by amplifying electrical mechanisms. They amplify the fire of this information. And I'm saying that that's also guided by biological valences, something that's really well accepted in our current biology. The valence of sugar, the valence of a good food, the valence of whatever, reproduction, the valence of course I recognize that we have subjective differences in this as well. And then I introduced something that is even higher order, as like for example values, as the case of the monk, that can repress his autonomic and even sympathetic reflex system and even autonomic system in favor of a moral cause, actually protesting against the Vietnam War. So, and it's just possible because they have a highly capable inhibitory system, right? Yeah. Actually, I don't have a very anxious, naturally, not very repressed guy, but monks can do it. But we can train, of course. So I think that's what I'm talking about. I don't think that is a problem to the physicalism. I don't think this is a problem for any seriously oriented, guided scientific theory. And I don't think that's a problem for philosophy as well. I don't see any problem here to say that this is decision making, but this is not free will. And as Adina shows, if people can control those background decisions, even if they cannot control the action about to happen, situations, people are already responsible for their behaviors. Of course, in the seventh book of the Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle already was guessing about that. I will agree with Aristotle as well that some people are not responsible for their actions because they lack in, let's say, in principle, or they lack in they have those mechanisms compromised. They cannot. They're those people that say they cannot control their actions. Those are not being imputable. But I think if you have this differentiation, people that are within this scope of people that have more or less control, they're still imputable. They're still responsible for their actions. But of course, you have people that are out of that scope, and we cannot just, arrest them for things they cannot do otherwise. You see, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah, what I mean, Sam Harris would say, but even those inhibitory controls are also determinate. What do you say to him? So what?
I'm not concerned. I'm a physicalist. I'm not concerned with that. I'm just concerned with the ethical implications of it. I define myself as a non-radical reductive, but I'm non-complete reductible. I'm not a complete reductionist, but I try to reduce as much as possible. That's the thing. I mean, reducing is a good thing. You can show by a simpler set of laws what's happening, but you cannot just throw the water of the baby. You try to get rid of the dirty water, but why to keep the baby? I'm not throwing the baby with the bath water. Conscious is the baby. Zombie baby. No, look, free will. So I'll give you a very precise definition. If free will means to, as a bracket in the causal chain that is due for something out of the physical world, I disagree with that. That's why I use the full-fledged version of free will. I'm not denying compatibilist versions of free will, but I'm saying free will in the sense of Kant. I don't believe it. That's what I'm saying. So a full-fledged version of free will, we need to can break the causal chain, consciousness get out of nowhere, but this vision is not even possible in my view because consciousness is electromagnetic phenomenon. So what's the problem? Consciousness is high five. High five is energy. What's the problem? You're so used by misleading philosophy to believe that consciousness is out of the realm, the physical realm, the only that exists. They have problems to compatibilize things. I don't have to compatibilize. I just have to compatibilize information processing, not two different stuff. There's no essential difference here. It's just levels of the same thing in different levels of complexity. That's what I'm talking about.
Gabriel, I have a curiosity. I want to know how you use the Fourier equation in your work.
I just assume Shannon's entropy as given. What is important is to differentiate resolution from scope. And scope is an actual physical property, and resolution is an informational property. Why this strategy is interesting? Actually, this strategy was developed by Ryan. I don't know if Ryan's from New Zealand or Australia now, but that was developed by Ryan, as I quoted him. I'm not saying that this is my creation. What I do is to encompass Ryan's and other models together, and I think this model is an interesting one. So what I'm saying is, with the decrease of uncertainty, I think that what brain is doing is decreasing uncertainty. Brain works decreasing uncertainty. But brain, as Georg would say, with a very German accent, is a lazy device. So brain always uses the most simple way to encompass information. So that's why suppression and inhibition are so important. But actually, by the way, there's a serious connection between suppression and inhibition. The more you inhibit something, you have more resources available for other representations or other processing, other forms of processing. The same thing, if you give a lot of attention to something, if you use amplificatory power, you will have less resources for the other things. And it brings a very economic device. Those things work together, you see? It's purely electrical thing. I don't think that's a problem, but that's how we select the stuff.
It's an interpretation about this. You don't use the equation, really use the equation. Choose some.
No, I mean I'm not modeling brain in terms of computer models.
Okay.
What I use, it's here. We use that as premises to do the kind of analysis we do here. For example, we isolate band limits and I try to guess which of those band limits are related with your resting state activity. So you get like delta, theta, alpha. We do like sophisticated analysis of those bands. We try to see how those bands correspond, for example, to any2 amplitude. And when you got the resting state, there's your personal signature.
Those dates you catch on the work of someone else.
Okay. Here. For example, you have any2 negative amplitude here. What we do, we analyze that to see exactly which are the areas of the brain that are connected with any2 amplitude. Then we go for the bands, or we call the specific band analysis to see which of those bands are in the same frequencies, how we could use, for example, Pearson's correlation to see how they variate. Those are the strategies. You're concerned with the Shannon entropy, isn't it? Shannon entropy is not entropy in Barry Lowell's work and mine are absolutely different. He was talking about thermodynamics. I'm talking about information entropy. Those are two different ways of totally different. I think that's the problem. You're confusing thermodynamic entropy with informational entropy. Those are absolutely different concepts.
Okay, thanks.
I mean, whoever bridged this gap between thermodynamic entropy and Shannon entropy could have a Nobel Prize. I'm not in this field. But it's an amazing question, but I don't have this capacity. I'm not looking for a Nobel Prize. Just want to make decision-making viable in physical ways.
Yes, that's about it. Thank you, Gabriel. Thank you very much.